Good evening, everyone. There comes a time in life when your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was. And for the narcissist, that silence isn't just deafening, it's destructive. When someone with a narcissistic identity loses you, they don't just lose a person, they lose a source of energy. They lose the mirror that made them feel whole, even if only for a moment. They didn't love you for who you are, they loved how they felt in your reflection. But here's the truth they never saw coming: you were the light. And when the light walks away, the illusion collapses. For the narcissist, control is everything. It is not merely a preference, it is the mechanism by which they navigate the world. It is how they create a sense of identity in a reality that feels unstable beneath the surface. Control isn't just about behavior or outcomes, it's about perception. It's about shaping how they are seen, how they are remembered, and most of all, how you reflect back their carefully crafted narrative. In the beginning, they construct the illusion. Through charm, mirroring love, bombing, and intensity, they create a false sense of safety, of unity, of you and me against the world. They seem to understand you at a soul level. They anticipate your needs, they echo your dreams, they match your language. But it's all an echo. Not of you, but of what they want you to believe about them. You see, this illusion of control isn't born from power. It's born from fear, deep, unconscious fear of unworthiness. A fear so buried that they will build entire psychological infrastructures to avoid ever confronting it. They manipulate the external world in an effort to escape the internal chaos. And when they find someone with empathy, presence, depth, someone like you, they don't just find a person, they find a vessel, a stage, a space where their illusion can play out undisturbed. But control requires compliance. It needs your belief, your trust, your energy. Without it, the illusion doesn't function. So they push boundaries in small, subtle ways, then bigger, bolder ones. And as long as you stay, adapt, explain, forgive, justify, they believe the illusion is working. But here's what they never account for: your awakening. They don't realize that something inside you will begin to stir. A quiet whisper of self-trust. A flicker of truth that says, this isn't love. They don't prepare for the moment you begin to see. Because the moment you shift from emotional enmeshment to conscious observation, the entire foundation of control begins to shake. And when you leave, physically, emotionally, spiritually, the illusion doesn't just crack. It collapses. You take your energy with you, your attention. You're witnessing all the subtle forms of emotional fuel that kept their ego inflated. And in your absence, they come face to face with a terrifying truth: they were never in control. They never controlled your essence, your worth, your reality. They only controlled your perception. And now that perception is changing, evolving, ascending beyond the reach of their manipulation. And this is the collapse they cannot process, because once the illusion shatters, there's no fallback. There's no deeper, grounded self to return to. Everything was curated. Every moment was manufactured to maintain a grip on the external, because the internal was too fragmented to face. They don't just lose you, they lose the stage. They lose the story where they played the hero, the partner, the irresistible, misunderstood soul. They lose the carefully placed mask that only worked in the presence of your gaze. And now, the mask starts to slip, not just to the world, but to themselves. What's left is silence, and not the peaceful kind. It's the kind of silence that echoes with questions they can't answer. Who am I without their attention? What if I was never in control? What if the love I manipulated was the only real thing I ever touched? And that silence grows. Because narcissism feeds on noise, on distraction, on validation, on control. But now the external no longer bends to their will. The old tactics don't work. The charm doesn't land. The manipulation feels obvious, transparent, because your absence altered the frequency. It shifted the dynamic entirely, and they can feel it deeply, disturbingly. It isn't that they miss love. It's that they miss the illusion of love that gave them control. And without it, the structure begins to dissolve, thought by thought, moment by moment. The collapse continues for the narcissist. Emotional supply is not optional. It is essential. It is their life force, the invisible fuel that sustains the illusion of self. But it's not just attention they seek. It's emotional reaction, resonance, engagement. Whether it's your admiration, your empathy, your anger, your confusion, it all feeds them. Every sigh, every tear, every explanation, every attempt to understand them is absorbed into their system like oxygen. You become, over time, less of a person in their eyes and more of a resource. A well they can draw from endlessly. They may disguise this dynamic in affection, flattery, or dependency, but beneath the surface, the truth remains. And you are feeding from your energy. You give even when you're unsure. You give even when you feel something is wrong. You give because you love and because you hope. And this giving becomes their drug. A subtle addiction forms, not to your love, but to your responsiveness, to the energetic dance where they provoke, and you respond, where they withhold and you chase, where they wound and you try to heal. It doesn't matter if the emotion is positive or negative. In their internal economy, all energy is currency. Whether you're praising them or pleading with them, laughing with them or crying because of them, it means one thing. You're still plugged in. You're still inside the system. You're still accessible. This is how they maintain control through energetic transactions. But what happens when you stop reacting? What happens when the supply is cut off? Not out of punishment, but out of awakening. At first, they may provoke harder. They may escalate, test, tempt, guilt, seduce, anything to regain access to the energetic well that once overflowed so easily. But if you remain still, if you remain grounded, if your nervous system no longer lights up in their presence, something shifts. They feel it. Not intellectually, but somatically. They feel it in the void where your attention used to land, where your validation used to lift them, where your worry used to orbit around their chaos. And that void begins to grow. This is not like a typical breakup for them. This is not a simple case of missing someone. This is energetic collapse, because your energy was more than companionship. It was scaffolding. It was structure. It held up the version of themselves they projected to the world. Without your gaze reflecting back their narrative, they start to lose shape. They begin to disintegrate, not physically, but energetically, psychologically. Their sense of specialness fades. Persona they built starts to glitch. The superiority they once displayed so effortlessly becomes forced, brittle, transparent. Because what was once effortlessly maintained through your emotional labor must now be propped up alone, and they are not equipped for that. They never developed the internal architecture to self-source worth. They've relied on external mirrors for so long, they've forgotten there's even a self behind the mask. And so they begin to seek substitutes. Fast. Desperately, but nothing feels the same. No new person reflects them as vividly. No one offers the same depth of reaction, the same richness of feeling, the same subtle attunement you once gave so freely. And even if someone else mirrors them, it feels like an imitation. Because it is. Oh, it's not you. It's not the same frequency. And slowly the withdrawals set in, not just emotional, but energetic. The mood swings, the restlessness, the anger masked as detachment, the need to pull you back in, not for love, not for closure, but to feel alive again. Because your presence was never neutral, you carried resonance, emotion, vitality. You were the source they never acknowledged, but always relied on. And now that source has gone silent. The signal has faded. And in the silence, they begin to feel the weight of their own emptiness, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience. The cold space where warmth used to live. The stillness where your energy used to pulse. The reality that what they fed on was never theirs to own. There is something haunting about true connection. Not just emotional closeness or physical proximity, but the rare, sacred resonance that occurs when one soul truly sees another. It doesn't happen often, and for someone like the narcissist, it happens even less. Not because they're incapable of receiving it, but because they're too defended to fully recognize it in real time. And yet, despite all their strategies to control perception, despite their addiction to validation, despite the fortress of ego they hide behind, fooled. When they meet someone who holds presence, softness, and emotional truths up without masks, who brings empathy without agenda, who offers understanding even when it isn't deserved, something gets in. Maybe not all at once, maybe not consciously, but it lands. It leaves an imprint. Because no amount of manipulation can completely erase the experience of being seen authentically. No illusion, no tactic, no false persona can fully replace the feeling of being met by someone who feels deeply and listens beneath the surface. And that was you. You didn't just interact with them. You connected. You listened in ways they didn't even know they longed for. You paid attention to the details between their words, the silence between their stories. You noticed things no one else noticed. You remembered what others forgot. You held emotional space they didn't know how to ask for. You offered realness in a world where they were used to wearing masks. But here's the paradox. In the moment, they couldn't appreciate it. Not truly. They were too absorbed in control, too fused with performance, too consumed with managing how they were seen to fully surrender to being seen. Real connection requires vulnerability, requires openness. It demands presence. And they were too guarded, too armored, too practiced at disconnection to let themselves truly fall into that depth with you. So they distorted it. They minimized your warmth. They questioned your intentions. They weaponized your care. They treated your devotion like a weakness. Because to fully acknowledge the truth of what you offered would require them to face the hollowness of what they offered in return. And they weren't ready to do that. But when you leave, when your energy is no longer accessible, when your emotional presence is no longer felt, when the dynamic is no longer available to feed off, something begins to echo in the space you once occupied. It's subtle at first. A sensation, a memory, a moment that replays uninvited. The softness in your voice, the calm in your energy, the way you used to look at them, not as someone to fix or control, but simply as someone to understand. It's in the way you touch them with your words, the way your silence could hold more truth than 1,000 compliments. The way you listened without always offering answers. And that's when it starts the echo. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's not even linear, but it's persistent. It lingers behind conversations with new people. It flickers through interactions that feel shallow in comparison. It resurfaces in quiet moments when they expect to feel nothing but are met with an ache they can't name. It's the echo of something real, something rare, something they didn't know how to nurture when it was right in front of them. Because now, in your absence, everything feels thinner. Interactions feel performative. Connections feel transactional. There is no depth, no soul, no soft mirror to reflect their complexity back to them. They can charm, seduce, provoke, manipulate, but the resonance is gone. The electricity is missing. What remains is a hollow performance with no one behind the curtain to recognize the act for what it is. The echo gets louder over time, not in volume, but in contrast. The shallowness of other connections becomes a mirror. The emptiness of surface-level engagement becomes amplified. The people who now surround them may feed their ego, but not their essence. And the memory of your presence, your emotional clarity, your honest reflection, your unwavering empathy, begins to haunt the quiet spaces. It creeps in between the laughs that don't land. It lingers in the eyes of people who don't truly see them. It surfaces in the stillness they once ran from. Not because they suddenly evolved, not because they've become capable of holding true connection, but because they finally feel the absence of what they never allowed themselves to fully receive. You didn't come into their life by accident. You weren't just another name, another body, another temporary fix for a deeper hunger they couldn't name. No, your presence carried something disruptive. Not chaotic, not aggressive, not loud, but deeply unsettling in the way truth often. You brought with you a frequency they weren't familiar with, but couldn't ignore. You mirrored something back to them they hadn't yet been ready to face. Not their strengths, not their charm, not their curated image, but their shadows, their fractures, their unintegrated wounds. And you did this without trying, without force, simply by being what you are: awake, attuned, emotionally alive. In your presence, the game began to glitch. You didn't react the way others had. You didn't collapse under pressure. You didn't fall for the same illusions. At first, they may have seen this as resistance, maybe even as a challenge. But what they were really encountering was your center, your self-possession, your unwillingness to abandon yourself just to be close to them. And that's when the disturbance began, an internal disturbance that no amount of control, seduction, or emotional leverage could quiet. They were drawn to you for reasons they didn't understand. It wasn't just attraction. It wasn't admiration. It was something older, something deeper, something archetypal. You represented both what they wanted and what they feared, because deep down beneath the mask, they've always known they were disconnected from themselves, from intimacy, from the truth of who they are beneath performance. And then there you were, living proof that wholeness exists, that presence is possible, that love doesn't have to be earned through manipulation or control. You didn't try to fix them. You didn't fight them for power. You simply stayed rooted in yourself. And that became unbearable, because the more rooted you were, the more lost they felt. The more whole you became, the more fragmented their illusion appeared. Your clarity highlighted their confusion. Your boundaries exposed their manipulation. Your emotional integrity illuminated their internal chaos. Every time you chose truth over appeasement, every time you chose calm over reaction, every time you chose to remain grounded instead of getting swept into their story, you were planting seeds, not in the way they would ever admit. Not in the way you might have hoped, but in the quiet, uncomfortable places of their psyche that no one else had ever touched. You awakened something that had been buried, something they didn't have language for. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because here's the paradox of the awakening you triggered. It isn't loud. It isn't immediate. It doesn't come wrapped in gratitude or recognition. It comes in fragments, in flashes, in breakdowns they don't understand, in the restless discontent that follows your absence, in the way they start to notice patterns that used to be invisible, in the way their own behavior begins to repulse them, if only for a second, in the way they can no longer enjoy the manipulations that once made them feel powerful. You triggered a collapse of comfort. You shattered the illusion that they were untouchable. You broke the spell that allowed them to move through life without ever confronting the self beneath the performance. And now something has stirred, a fracture in the shell, a tremor in the narrative, a question in the silence. They may not know what it is. They may not know it came from you. They may not want to look at it, much less name it, but they feel it. In their body, in their nervous system, in the hollowness that feels deeper than it used to, in the dreams that linger longer than they should, in the strange, unnameable longing that follows them like a shadow when the distractions wear off. It's not peace. It's not healing. It's not transformation, but it is the beginning of awareness, the first flicker, the slow, aching crawl of consciousness pushing through the cracks of a carefully constructed self. And you were the mirror that made the reflection impossible to unsee. Absence is not just emptiness. It is not merely the space left behind when someone walks away. True absence, conscious, embodied absence, creates a vacuum of energy so precise, so piercing, that it rearranges the environment it once held. And for someone like the narcissist, your absence doesn't just register as loss. It registers as destabilization on an energetic level. Because what you brought into their world wasn't just attention or affection or presence. It was frequency. Coherence, a vibrational rhythm that, even if they couldn't understand it, brought a sense of alignment they never quite knew they needed. In your presence, they felt temporarily tethered to something real, something pure, something steady. You became the regulating force for an internal chaos they couldn't name. And as long as you were within reach, they could borrow your balance. They could feed from your grounding. They could siphon fragments of clarity from your emotional availability and use it to construct the illusion that they, too, were whole. But that illusion was never sustainable. It was always borrowed. It was always externally sourced. And so, when you began to awaken, when you began to detach, when your nervous system stopped responding, when your heart began to pull its light back inward, the shift began, not gradually, quantumly. This is what they didn't expect, that your absence would alter the entire field, that once you withdrew your energy, reality itself would begin to shift, not because you wanted to hurt them, not because you made some grand declaration, but because your energetic withdrawal pulled the plug on a false system of coherence they had come to rely on. Suddenly, things didn't work the way they used to. Their charm felt flat. Their manipulations misfired. The people who once orbited them with admiration began to feel dull in comparison to the depth you once brought. Their usual tricks for regaining control, guilt, seduction, projection, lost their potency. Not just because you were gone, but because your leaving initiated a kind of collapse in the quantum architecture of the illusion they'd been living in. Because you were not just a person in their life. You were a node, an anchor, a stabilizing presence that held a kind of sacred geometry together. When you stepped out, it wasn't just your voice or your touch or your empathy that disappeared. It was the entire energetic blueprint they had quietly constructed around your presence. And now, without that blueprint, they are lost in a dimension they can no longer control. Time stretches. Memory distorts. Admitting that something real slipped through their grasp, that your presence was more than convenient, that it activated something they couldn't override. And so instead of healing, the mind loops. Instead of processing, it replays. It could be a specific moment, The way you looked at them the last time, without fear, or the silence in your absence that sounded different from anyone else's. It could be a scent, a voice, a song, a phrase you used to say that embedded itself into their psyche without permission. It could be a memory that wasn't even dramatic, just real, just undeniable in a life full of denial. And these loops don't play gently. They aren't cinematic recollections. They come like hauntings, at night, in stillness, during emotional lows, when the performance has dropped and the world stops watching. In those spaces where the curated self dissolves, memory slips through the cracks. It's not romanticized nostalgia. It's not longing for love lost. It's the reactivation of something that couldn't be controlled. The memory of an energetic collision they couldn't assimilate, a confrontation with their own emptiness mirrored by your fullness. And because they cannot integrate it, they revisit it, not intentionally, not willingly, but repetitively. This is the looping program. Revisit, reframe. Try to blame, try to forget, try to replace, but nothing replaces frequency. No one else carries your particular emotional resonance. You mirrored with presence, and that kind of reflection is not easily erased. So the mind loops, the program repeats. The file opens itself again and again, asking silent questions they don't know how to answer. Questions coded in sensation rather than words, in muscle memory, in the nervous system, in the feeling of something slipping through their fingers that was never meant to be owned, only honored. And because they never learned to honor, they replay, trying to alter the ending in retrospect, trying to construct a version of you they can manage, trying to resolve a frequency through logic. But the loop doesn't end, because the lesson was never learned. The presence was never integrated. The real was never fully received. And so the mind circles back again and again through the unresolved, through the unhealed, through the unforgettable. You didn't come to break them. That was never your intention. You didn't enter their life as punishment or consequence, though later they might reframe it that way. You arrived in the quiet way that truth often does. Not loud, not forceful, but persistent, with eyes that saw through the performance, with a nervous system that didn't flinch at their chaos, with a presence that didn't beg for their attention but made them feel, for the first time in a long time, seen without manipulation, and touched without transact at first. They mistook you for another opportunity, another reflection to mold, another source of fuel to extract, another mirror to distort into something flattering. But you weren't malleable, not in the ways they'd grown accustomed to. You didn't contort yourself to meet their wounds. You didn't collapse under their demands. You didn't lose yourself in their stories. You stood, solid, present, awake. And that is what triggered the slow unraveling. Because narcissists are not truly blind to what's real. They are terrified of it, terrified of what it will demand, terrified of what it will reflect, terrified of the emptiness it will expose. You became that mirror, though, not by attacking, not by shaming, but by holding your truth so steadily that it began to fracture the illusion they'd worked so hard to protect. They couldn't dominate you the way they did others. They couldn't predict your next move. They couldn't easily manipulate your emotions or script your reactions. You were responsive, but not reactive. You were emotionally attuned, but not emotionally dependent. You offered compassion, but not compliance. And in doing so, you disrupted their entire internal system. You challenged the myth of superiority they relied on to survive. You punctured the fantasy that they could control every outcome. You introduced a frequency their nervous system hadn't been trained to receive. Safety. Real safety. Not compliance, not fear, not seduction. Safety is in you weren't trying to take anything from them. You weren't seeking power or playing games. You were just being. And in the presence of that kind of being, the false self begins to tremble. You became the catalyst, not because you wanted to, but because you were simply unwilling to abandon yourself for the sake of staying in their orbit. Your refusal to shrink, to edit, to betray your center became a quiet revolution inside their psyche, a ripple that began to interfere with the frequency of their projections. A presence that made it harder for them to pretend. When someone is committed to avoiding their inner world, there's nothing more threatening than someone who has made peace with their own. And you had. Or at least you were on that path. And that made them start to notice everything they had been avoiding. Not all at once. Not clearly, but through sensations. subtle ruptures, emotional static. Suddenly the lies didn't land as smoothly. The stories didn't soothe. The usual tricks didn't satisfy. You brought them face to face with their own limitations, with the emptiness behind their smile, with the performance behind their charm, with the deep, gnawing ache they feel when there's no one around to reflect the image they've constructed. You didn't attack them. You revealed them, not to others, not even directly to themselves, but to the space between what they pretended to be and what they feared they actually were. And once seen, that space cannot be unseen. This is the reckoning, not a dramatic collapse, not a single moment of transformation, but a gradual breakdown of the internal scaffolding they had once believed was indestructible. It shows up as restlessness, as inner conflict, as a loss of control over their own curated identity. They start to question, but without the tools to answer. They start to feel, but without the emotional vocabulary to name it. They start to remember, but only in fragments, half-truths, and emotional residues that cling to the edges of their awareness. And you, without forcing it, without even meaning to, became the turning point, not because they're grateful, not because they said thank you, not because they admitted what they felt, but because something shifted, because something cracked, because something they had buried began to surface the moment they could no longer feed off the light you once gave so freely. And now the energy you withdrew echoes in the chambers where their false self used to feel strong. And the reckoning continues, not in words, not in clarity, but in sensation, in longing, in silence. And so, in the quiet after the chaos, in the stillness left behind, when your energy no longer fills the room, the reckoning begins, not just for them, but for the story itself. Because you were never just a chapter in their narrative. You were the turning point, the anomaly, the glitch in the program. The reflection they couldn't control, the presence they couldn't possess. They may never admit it. Their ego may never allow the confession. But in the deepest layers of their subconscious, your impact lives on as a mirror, as a trigger, as a frequency that made their illusion tremble. You were the invitation they never accepted, the awakening they resisted, the connection they couldn't sustain. And when you walked away, not in anger, but in alignment, you didn't just leave, you altered the field, because what you offered was real, and real is unforgettable. Real doesn't fade with time. Real echoes, real haunts, real heals, just not always the one who first needed the healing. So while they sit with loops they can't exit, ghosts they can't name, and truths they can't outrun, you've already shifted, grown, softened, rooted deeper into yourself. You were never meant to be their source. You were the mirror, the catalyst, the lesson. And now as the silence stretches, as the illusions glitch, as the absence expands into its full shape, they begin to feel what they never wanted to face. The real regret, the one that lingers long after the performance fades. The regret that haunts narcissists after losing someone they could never truly reach, but always secretly needed.